Now, obviously, there are some practical problems that monetary and fiscal policy makers come across and they face, which does not mean that monetary fiscal policies are useless. They are, as I said, very effective. They are being commonly used by most of the central banks and the government. But there are practical issues. There are practical problems. And as far as monetary policy is concerned, you see, first of all, it is difficult to control the money supply. So difficult to control the money supply. Meaning that yes, it's one thing to say theoretically that central bank has decided to increase the money supply, but to practically implement that, it's not that easy. Now, I don't want to get into the details of why the central bank does not have total control over money supply, but primarily the idea is that look, in addition to central bank, the commercial banks, they also have a role to play in deciding the country's money supply. So sometimes the central bank, it wants to increase the money supply by, let's say, 1,000 rupees, but it is unable to do so. Sometimes in its attempt to increase the money supply by 1,000 rupees, it ends up sort of increasing the money supply by, let's say, 3,000 rupees. So it is difficult to have a precise control over the country's money supply, and therefore practically it is not very easy to always implement the monetary policy as desired. Then the second issue is that sometimes some countries, they are already operating at an interest rate of close to 0%. Now, if your country's interest rate is already close to 0%, then this tool of monetary policy, interest rate, you can't lower it anymore. So you can't pursue this expansionary monetary policy. You can't lower your interest rates in order to increase your aggregate demand, sometimes simply because your country's interest rates, they're already close to zero. So this is where we say that sometimes countries, they simply don't have enough monetary policy space. And then sometimes what happens is that, even if you have room to lower the interest rate, sometimes investment does not respond to lowering of interest rates. Now, to understand why that may happen, you see, think of a country which is undergoing a civil war and which is undergoing political turmoil, which is undergoing terrorist attacks, and overall the economy and the country, let's assume, is in a very bad shape. Now, in such a country, if the central bank starts lowering the interest rate, hoping that look, investment will increase and aggregate demand will increase and the economy will expand. Now, this is where we are saying that look, investment, yes, it is dependent upon interest rates. It's very closely related, or it's very sensitive to the interest rates. But obviously, there are other considerations that decide how much investment will take place in the country. So if you are in a civil war, if you are in a political turmoil, then regardless of what you do with your interest rates, investment will not respond. Now, there I have given you an extreme example, but what really happens is, you see, sometimes the economy is panicking and there is a lot of risk, and therefore the investors and households are afraid. And these are the sort of situations where even when the central bank tries to lower the interest rates, these investors, these households, they don't respond. They don't start borrowing more and they don't start investing and consuming more. And that is where we say that sometimes investment doesn't respond. There's just too much risk, and the households, the firms, they are just too afraid and they don't respond by increasing investment as the interest rates fall. And similarly, you can also think about the limitations of this policy of lowering the exchange rate. Because the way this is supposed to work is that if your exchange rates appreciate, then your exports will be cheaper, and therefore foreigners, they are assumed to start buying more exports. But then the issue is that if your country doesn't have enough capacity to produce this larger amount of goods, then despite of exchange rate depreciation, your exports will not increase, and therefore your aggregate demand will not increase. So think about a very, very poor country which has no factories, which have no skilled labor, which have no productive capacity. Now, if that country lowers its exchange rate, then yes, maybe foreigners, they would want to buy more of that country's cheaper products. But the thing is, that country doesn't have an industrial base, and therefore if it can't make all of those goods to export, then this exchange rate depreciation it won't be effective way of causing an increase in aggregate demand. So those are some of the practical difficulties that are faced by monetary policy makers. When it comes to fiscal policy, you see the biggest practical issue is the problem of time lag and delays, because here we are talking about government deciding to increase or decrease the amount of income tax and government spending in order to control the country's aggregate demand. And the thing is that whenever the government is involved, then obviously we have inefficiencies, we have delays, because governments, they usually take a lot of time to move on and make decisions. There is a lot of red tape, there is a lot of paperwork. So just think about a government thinking that, okay, we want to increase the aggregate demand, so therefore we need to lower the amount of income tax rate. Now this policy, the government, when it has to make this decision, then it will first conduct a lot of meetings amongst different departments, and then it will move summaries from one office to another office, and eventually maybe the bill will have to be passed through the parliament, which will be another whole process that will take time. And that is where we say that fiscal policy, between the point that you decide what policy has to be implemented towards the end where you get through all the paperwork and you are actually ready as a government to actually implement that fiscal policy, you have wasted so much time that maybe the economy moves into some other equilibrium where the policy required is totally different from what you have been deciding to implement. So long story short, the main issue with fiscal policy is it takes a lot of time. The government has its own coordination issues, and there is a huge time lag involved, and therefore sometimes the economy just moves out of whatever inflationary gap it is in before the central bank can be ready to come in and implement its fiscal policy. Again, I have exaggerated this explanation over here. It doesn't mean that fiscal policy is ineffective, but there is this issue. It takes a lot of time. Then the other problem with fiscal policy implementation is the political constraints that any government faces. Now, what do we mean by political constraints is that, you see, here we are just saying that you are playing around with the income tax and government spending just to control this aggregate demand, which is true. But if you think about the reality, then when government plays around and changes the amount of income tax or increases or decreases its government spending, these are politically very important decisions, because increase in income tax, obviously the population, it won't like it, and your voters won't like it. And similarly, if you start lowering your government spending and maybe start spending less on free hospitals for the poor, and maybe the government starts spending less on infrastructure and roads and all these things, that again has political implications. So sometimes the government, it can't just control government spending and income tax as a tool of fiscal policy, thinking of, okay, what I want to do with aggregate demand. Instead, political considerations and political realities take importance. They take precedence over the needs of the fiscal policy, and therefore it is not always possible for the government to play around and change income tax and government spending as required by the country's fiscal policy. You have to give in to political pressures, and maybe sometimes you can't, although you want, but you can't lower the income tax, you can't reduce the government spending. And then there is a third problem, or third practical issue that fiscal policy makers face, and that is related to the problem of whether the government in the first place does have fiscal space or not. Now, what do we mean by fiscal space? Well, you see, the source of revenue for most of the governments, or all the governments, the source of revenue is tax. Whereas then the government every year spends a lot of money on all the different things. Now, if your country is earning less amount of tax revenue, let's say just 50 rupees of tax revenue, and let's assume the spending of the government is on the other hand 75 rupees, then this is where we say that the government is overspending, and the government's budget, its revenue minus its spending, we say will be negative 25, which means we are saying that the government is experiencing a budget deficit. It is spending more than its revenues. Now, it is normal for governments to go into budget deficits. Many governments can afford to do that because they're overspending. They can borrow whatever they overspend. But the problem is that if your country is already in a budget deficit, if it is already spending more than what it is earning and therefore it already has to borrow, then this means that your country's government won't have enough fiscal space. Meaning that if you have to, let's say, expand your economy and increase your aggregate demand, this government would have to spend more. It would have to increase this G component, and the government, to expand the economy, would have to lower the amount of income tax, meaning it would have to sacrifice or give up some of its revenues. So if the country is already in a budget deficit, and if you come and tell them that, look, just bring in 10 rupees of tax instead of 50, lower the amount of income tax and spend more, instead of 75, spend 200, then this government will go into an even bigger budget deficit, and therefore it will have to borrow even more, which is practically possible. But if you see the government keeps on borrowing to fund this expansionary fiscal policy, then the problem that will ultimately create is that this government, it will take away all the funds that are available for borrowing in the economy, and that won't leave any borrowing left or any borrowing available for the private sector. That is, we say the government, if it borrows too much and takes away all the funds that are available in the country to be borrowed, then the private sector, we say, will be crowded out, or we say there will be this crowding out effect of excessive government borrowing. They won't leave anything for the private sector to borrow, which is very harmful. Because if private sector has nothing to borrow, then private sector won't be in a position to invest. Now again, we don't want to go into more detail of this point than we already have, but remember that fiscal policy, yes, in theory it works very easily. You just play around with income tax, government spending, but there are these practical issues, these limitations, because of which it is not always very easy to implement the fiscal policy as desired. So those are some of the weaknesses, some of the limitations of fiscal monetary policy. But as I said, broadly speaking, do remember they're both powerful policy tools, both these monetary and fiscal policy. And in principle, what they try to do is they try to manage the country's aggregate demand in order to manage the country's business cycles and sort of iron out these short-run fluctuations around the country's potential output.